Hello. This is the first shiur, which is going to be done through Zoom. I hope everybody's well. This shiur is actually coming all the way from 37 Kings Road. I haven't yet gone. But I thought by the time I finish loading the cars with freezers and clothes and food, like Yiddish family needs to take, I will not be able to give the shiur. So I'm doing the shiur before I even go. It's actually the night before. We're up to Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, about 15 lines from the top. The Ekes Succca is about which things are kosher for Succca. But the Ma'aseh, the Gemara mentions a few things which come in by the way, because we talked about bundles. So we're up to the dot for Omar Rav Chisda. What's like this? Omar Rav Chisda Ma'arvina Ba'ashela. Hani Merevisa de Agmo. The moroi that comes from the marsh. The Torah tells us on Seder night, Matzos Moim, a person has to eat moroi. We learned in Pesachim that there's actually 5 different kinds of moroi that one is supposed to eat. One of those was called the moroi that came from the marsh. And the problem is that it's not the normal moroi. The proof being it's called the moroi that came from the marsh. So if that's the case, the question is it kosher as moroi or not? So the Gemara says, Adam Yotze ben Yedei Chavosei bePesach. The fact that it is called moroi of the marshland, moroi of the Agam, does not spoil its status, and it can still be used on Pesach. The Torah says you should use a hyssop. When did the Torah say you should use a hyssop? Once by the mitzvah, sprinkling the blood onto the mitzvah. Once when they came out to Mitzrayim, they had to sprinkle blood on the doorposts and on the lintel, and twice by the Parah Adumah. Once to throw it into the fire, and once to sprinkle with it the water which had the ashes of the Parah Adumah inside it. In these 4 places, which the Torah talks about the Esav, the Gemara Mishnah, the Beis tells us that only certain kind, Esav means a hyssop, and there are many species of hyssop. And the Beis says Esav, le Esav Yavan, not the Greek one, le Esav Kuchli, not the blue one, le Esav Midbari, not the one that grows in the desert, le Esav Romi, and not the one that grows in Rome, le Kol Esav Sheish L'Shem Levai, and no any hyssop that's got another name, an additional name. So we see clearly that when the Torah says a particular plant is to be used, the Torah means that there has to be one which has the name of that plant and not a strange other name to it. So when it comes to moroi, you told us that moroi of the marsh is okay, but that's not normal moroi, the proof being it's got a different name. But by Esav, you said it's no good. What is the difference between moroi and Pesach that you're allowed to have a different name and the Esav that you're not allowed to have a different name? So the Gemara gives 2 answers. Omar Abaya, the name changed before Matan Torah, and the Torah says which name you should have, and if it's no good, and that's why the Torah doesn't want it. The name never changed before Matan Torah, meaning like this. The question, when did the name of this particular plant change? Says Abaya, that regarding the moroi, the name only changed after Matan Torah. During Matan Torah, all moroi had the same name. So if I say you have to eat moroi, and this was one of the kinds which is called moroi, it's okay. The fact that after Matan Torah it changed the name doesn't matter, because when the Torah was given and the Torah says eat moroi, this is one of the names, this is the moroi which the Torah is talking about. But when it comes to the hyssop, the name was already changed before Matan Torah. And the Torah says, Esav, without adding another name. The Torah means it has to be specifically an Esav without an added name. The Svara Rabbi is very, very straightforward. Again, the Torah, if I say to you, for example, take an apple, and then later things change into different red apple, green apple, Granny Smith. Since I said take an apple, and only later these new names come up, so any apple is good. But if already the name's already been in place, and I say to you, I want you to take a normal apple, and there's already other apples out which have got different names to it, not the normal stuff. So therefore, obviously, I'm excluding that. So Rashi says, so Rabbi says, when it came to the Hyssop, when did the new names come up? Already before Matan Torah. And the Torah says, Ezoiv, to exclude these. Mashiach came to the Moroi, the name only changed after Matan Torah. During Matan Torah, they're all called Moroi. That's Rabbi's teretz. Rav Omar, Hanim Merisa Stama Shemayu. This is the normal Moroi. Bahai, the Korilahu, Merisa Dagmo, the fact that they call it the Moroi of the meadow, the Moroi of the swamp, is only Mishum de Mishtakcha Ba'agmo. That's what you find it. There are two reasons why we give it a plant, a species, a new name. Sometimes because it's got something fundamentally different about it. And that is the case of the Azov. It's something different. The Azov that's in Rome is not the same Azov that is in other countries. So since the Torah says Azov, it's different. The different Azov is no good. But this Moroi, the only difference that it has about it is what? Is that this is where it's found. It's found in the meadow. Since the only difference is that it's found in the meadow, and there's no intrinsic difference to it, therefore it's okay. Therefore, let's explain, according to Rabbi, the Moroi of the meadow, of the swamp, is no different to all other Moroi. It's got that name because that's where it's commonly found. And therefore, since that's where it's commonly found, therefore it's okay. It's normal Moroi, and the only new name is because of the fact that it is found in these other places. Now, if Kimina would be that, for example, nowadays we eat lettuce for more. And there are many kinds of lettuce. Romaine lettuce, there's a heart lettuce, I've forgotten the name. And the question is, are all these lettuces okay? So if the name is a different name, for example, it's got a certain name to it, where it's a different kind of lettuce altogether, so then it's no good at all. The person can't use it. If the only name we change is where it comes from, that's okay. So the person has to be careful with the name when you choose a plant for a mitzvah. Why is it got a different name? If it's because it's intrinsically different, it's no good. If it's just that's where it comes from, it's okay. Okay. In our Mishnah, we learned that a bundle is no good. Now, we were rushing then, so I didn't have time to do it. But if you turn the page, go back to Yud Beis Amud Aleph, the bottom tosis on Yud Beis Amud Aleph are tiny, tiny tosis. Tosis chavile is what the Befarish B'Yushalmi dein chavila pchus b'esim v'chamish konim. A bundle is 25. So if you've got a bundle, let's say, of only 5, it doesn't matter. That's not called a bundle. Now the Gemara seems to contradict this Yerushalmi, and the Gemara talks about a bundle of 1, a bundle of 2, a bundle of 3. In order to reconcile, some say indeed it's a machlekas. According to the Yerushalmi, a bundle is only no good if it's 25. And according to the Bavli, a bundle is no good even if it's only got 2 or 3. It's already considered a bundle. Some say that it's indeed a machlekas Bavli Yerushalmi. Others say that this is not a machlekas Bavli Yerushalmi, and it's to do with the bundle that we mentioned right at the end of the Shiur on Monday, which was like this. We were talking about like a palm tree, which out of one branch grows many, many, many branches. And we said that that's not considered a bundle because the HaKadosh Baruch Hu made it into a bundle. And even if it's a bundle, why not? Because you're tying up one thing. But the question is, these kinds of bundles, which really look like a bundle and are very, very big in number, regarding these bundles, the Gemara over here has been more machmir, that you even 1 or 2 might, even 2 or 3 might be a bundle. So the Gemara goes through it. Omar Chista, Egad Bechad, bundle of 1, Lo Shmei Egad, that's not a bundle. Shloish, if it's 3, Shmei Egad, it is a bundle. Shnai Machlikas Abeisiv, abundance Machlikas Abeisiv and Chachamim. That's not. Mitzvahs Ezev, mitzvah of the Hesep, which we talked about, it comes up in a number of places. Shloisha Kolochin, it has to be 3 branches, 3 stalks, ubahen shloisha givoilin, and within each stalk has to have its own seeds, its own leaves coming out of it. That means only 3 stalks, but each stalk has to be a whole stalk. If you've got a stalk of, let's say, broccoli or something, you've got the stalk, and you've got the top of it that comes off it, of cabbage. So you need to have for hyssop the 3 stalks, and with the top head of the stalk. That is the Shittas Chacham. Rabbi Yosef mitzvahs Ezev shloisha givolin 3. V'shiyarov shnaim. Doesn't matter if there's only 2 left. V'gardumov, and if there's only the bottom piece, kolshu, it's okay if it's only a tiny bit. So there are 3 halachas regarding this bundle. One is that you have to have 3. One is that if you started with 3 and you remained there with 2, it's still okay. And the third halacha, that even though at the beginning you're supposed to start off with a stalk with the head to it, if the head fell off and all you've got left is the root, it's still okay. So most like this. The Succca we thought at the beginning with the Shiur v'shnayim, according to Rabbi, you see that the remainder is 2 tchilas andamishnayim. If he holds that the remainder is 2, you could start off with 2. That which it says 3, the mitzvah, it's only lechatchila. Since Rabbi holds 3 is only lechatchila, but the other 2 is okay. According to the Chachamim, 3 is ma'akev. So it comes out as machlokes Rabbanan Rabbi. According to Rabbanan, you have to have 3. According to Rabbi, it's only lechatchila 3. And the Torah says regarding Ezev, lokachto agudas Ezev. Agudas Ezev means a bunch of Ezev, a bunch of hyssop. So we see, according to the Chachamim, you have to have 3. According to Rabbi Yossi b'diavad, it's okay to have 2. So they're arguing what exactly is a bunch. That machlokes Rabbanan Rabbi Yossi is the same machlokes of the same shaila that Rav Chisda had, which he said is machlokes Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim, that if you put a bundle on a sukkah to use as schach, is the same machlokes regarding the bundle of the hyssop. Says the Gemara, that's not true. That's not true. You're wrong to say that according to Rabbi Yossi, it is only lechatchila to have 3. And b'diavad 2 is okay, and 2 is also considered a bundle. Says, well, that's not true. But Tanya, Rabbi Yossi says, Ezev shetchilose shnayim, and Ezev that you start off with 2. The shiur echad, or that you left over with 1, possible. Saying 2 different halachas. You have to start off with a bunch of 3. If you do not have a bunch of 3, it's no good. You have to start off with a bunch of 3. And after you have a bunch of 3, but if afterwards 1 fell out, it's okay. But if you started off with 2, or you started off with 3 and 2 fell out, and you've only got 1 left, that means either you started with 2, or you're finishing off with 1. In either case, Rabbi Yossi holds it's possible. So what do we see from Rabbi Yossi? That it's not a lechatchila dekadin. It's not lechatchila you have to have 3, but that is the ikar halacha that you have to have 3. That it is ma'akev to have 3. So we misunderstood the previous Beis. The previous Beis, the Chachamim said 3. Rabbi Yossi said even 2 of the remainder is okay. We thought Rabbi Yossi meant to say that it's only lechatchila to have 3, but the other 2 is okay. What the Gemara is saying now is that's a mistake. Rabbi Yossi is coming to be machmi on the Tanna Kama. The Tanna Kama said start off with 3 lechatchila, but the other 2 is also okay. Rabbi Yossi says to him, no, you're wrong. You have to start with 3. And only if b'diavad there's 2 at the end is okay. But if you only started off with 2, it's no good. Again, we have 2 discussions regarding a bundle. The bundle for schach, if it's possible or not. The bundle for the hyssop. And we said a bundle of 1 is okay. A bundle of 3 is no good. A bundle of 2 is machlokes Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim. In the Havamim of the Gemara understood that Rabbi Yossi is being meiko. The Chachamim say 3, Rabbi Yossi says even 2. And machlokes between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yossi regarding an Ezev, regarding a hyssop, is the same machlokes regarding the Succca. The Gemara says that's not true. Rabbi Yossi holds that you have to have 3, and it's ma'akev. It's ma'akev. Without it, it's no good. If you don't start off with 3, it's no good. But b'diavad, if you finished off with 2, it's okay. According to the Chachamim, you should start with 3. But even if you start off with 2, it is okay. So the word now says, Epoch, we have to turn it around. Rabbi Yossi, shloisha la'akev, 3 is ma'akev, la'abonon, shloisha la'mitzvah is only lechatchila. V'hotanya. This V'hotanya is different to the V'hotanya we had 3 lines ago. Before the Gemara says V'hotanya, the Gemara asks us as a kasha. V'hotanya, is that true? Here the Gemara is saying V'hotanya, and I'll prove to you that it is true. V'hotanya over here means, and I'll prove. Rashi often says V'hotanya benichusa. Benichusa means that says to be but the meaning gently. But Tanya, this is indeed what the Beis says. And so that's Tanya as a kasha. Here it's not a kasha, here it's as a support. Ezoi v'hisab shetchiloso shnayim. That you start off with two. The Shiur echad, you finish off with one kasha. That's the chachamim. That they say that, but if you start with two, it's okay. Until you finish off with, you start with one and you finish one. If you finish off with this puzzle, you said the second good, if one of them is finished, it's okay. Top of Yud Gimel on the Beis, and this is Shittas Chachamim. The Chachamim hold that if you start off with one, it's no good. But if you start off with two, but the evidence it's okay. So let's go summarize the halachas of the Hissa. According to Rabbi, you have to start with three. If you start off with three, and then in the middle of the process one falls out, then it's okay. But if you started off with two, it's no good. The Chachamim say no. Lechatchila, you should start with three. But if you by mistake start off with two, that's okay. And if you start off with two, and then one fell out and you've only got one left, that's also okay. Because they hold that Be'akav, what's the barest necessity is to start off with two and to finish off with one. According to Rabbi Yossi, the barest necessity is to start off with three and to finish off with two. The bundles that used to be in Surah, you can use them as chach. But they're bundles, and we learned in our mission that bundles are no good. The reason that bundles are no good is because we are concerned that if we allow people to use bundles, people will eventually rely on bundles. And what they'll do is, sometimes they'll take a bundle from the marketplace, leave it out to dry, and then they'll forget about it, and then they'll say by Succca, oh, that will be my schach. And the problem will be that will be tasev leimin also. So therefore, Merema says, but the bundles that are in Surah, that's okay. Why should the bundles in Surah be any better? Answers the Gemara. They would only bundle them for the process of counting. The moment they'd finish counting, they would spread them out. And as we explained, the whole problem of bundles is that we're choshesh that person may leave them there. But that's not going to happen in Surah, because the bundles of Surah were never used to be left there. The bundles of Surah were there only to be for the counting purposes. The moment the counting purposes was finished, they would completely unravel them and they would leave them out there to dry in a bundle. So the whole chashash of a bundle only exists if you are choshesh that you will leave it as a bundle. But these bundles, you would never leave them as a bundle. Says the Gemara, a new halacha. The huts which the bird hunters used to use. These huts require a little bit of explanation how they were made. I'm going to show a picture, and I hope that the picture is clear. I'm trying to describe it besides. So what happens is like this. This is the picture. If you look carefully, it is a picture. This picture I'm pointing at. What you would do is you take a huge bundle of sticks. They would want to hide out in the open. The birds shouldn't notice them. They would want to be protected from the shade. They couldn't start building a whole home. Protected from the sun, I mean. And they didn't want to build something. It was a whole business to build something. So what they did was they would just gather a whole big bundle of canes. And then at the top, they would take a knot and tie it properly together like a proper bundle. At the bottom, they wouldn't tie it together because you won't be able to get in. The whole purpose was to be able to sit inside the shade. They would let it open up, so it was tied up at the top. At the bottom, it would spread out, and then they would weave around string that the canes shouldn't fall apart. They would weave them together without tying them with a proper knot. And then they would sit inside it, and they could hunt the birds. And the halacha the Gemara says over here is that it is kosher, which the Gemara is very puzzled. Let's see the Gemara inside. Again, if you just untie the top, kasher is kosher. All you need to do is untie the top and it is kosher. The Gemara, why? They're tied up from the bottom. And if they're tied up from the bottom, so it should still be a bundle. So the Gemara gives two answers. We're talking about where you undid the knot. The Shonim asked the question. If you undid the knot, both at the top and at the bottom. So it's no longer a bundle. If it's no longer a bundle, so what in the world is the chiddush over here? Well, the Rishonim answer is like this, that you undid the knot, but it is still braided together. And you might have thought that everybody around looking at it, they will assume, what happens like this, you built it with knotting it. After it's been built, you can still undo the knot and it will still stay in place. So then you might have thought, okay, it's still going to stay in place, therefore it should be okay. So by looking at it as it is, it looks like it's a proper knot, and therefore people might think that it's no good. Kamash balon, that since it's not actually a knot, even though it looks like a knot, it's okay. That's one answer. Even if we say that you never undid the knot, and not that you can't carry it by holding on to the knot, that's not considered a knot. The knot which was done at the top was a very tight knot, a strong knot. The knot that was done at the bottom was a very loose knot. The Gemara says over here that since the knot was a very loose one, and if you'd pull the hut by the knots, what would happen is the whole thing would fall apart. So therefore, it's not considered a knot at all. Since it's not considered a knot, so therefore, it is not a bundle. This brings us for a few halacha lemaises. One, the halacha is you're not allowed to put a bundle of schach on your roof. You're not allowed to put a bundle of canes. If they're bundled together very loosely, in a kind of knot that cannot be strong enough to drag the canes along, then the halacha is that's not a knot, and you're allowed to use that as a bundle. Also, for the lulav, we mentioned already that you should do a double knot. This is one of the mekoros, because the Gemara here says, "Kol eged she'osu letaltel," a knot that's not strong enough that you can pull it along with a knot, lo yishmei eged, is not considered a knot. It says more like this, a new halach. Omar Abba Omar Shmuel. All the vegetables that you can use on Pesach for Moed, there are 5 different vegetables: lettuce, chrein, the 5 horseradish. Then he says 3 halachas. All of them are chumras, and some of them are even self-contradictory. What are they? Let's say you've got a lettuce leaf which is a tefach wide, and the halacha is that if something which is a tefach wide can spread tumah. So if you've got this lettuce leaf which is a tefach wide, and on the one end of the lettuce there's a dead body, and the other end of the lettuce underneath it is an apple, the apple becomes tummy, being in the tent of the dead body. Or if somebody walks underneath it, it becomes tummy. The reason being because it's a tefach wide. If it's a tefach wide, it's an oil, and oil spreads tumah. That's the first halacha. So you say to yourself, okay, if it's an oil, so if that's the case, it should block tumah. The halacha is, we've learned many times, that if you've got tumah, if you've got a dead body, and then you've got a tent over it, so then the tumah doesn't go up to the heavens. The tent blocks the tumah. So if you've got dead body, you put a lettuce leaf on top, and on top of the lettuce leaf, you put, let's say, an apple. So the chayre should be that the apple should remain torn. Why should it remain torn? Because you've got a tent protecting the dead body's tumah from going up to the heavens. So he says, no, here is more machmir, and he says, "Ve'ein chaytz mifnei tumah," and it does not stop the tumah. Since it doesn't, and it doesn't stop the tumah, so not only does it spread tumah as if it is a tent, but it doesn't block tumah as if it's not a tent. And one final halacha: if you use lettuce as chach, now obviously you can't use it as chach. Why? Because it's mekabel tumah. But let's say you use them before it is royo to be eaten. That means the roots of the lettuce, which cannot be eaten. So therefore, since it cannot be eaten, it's not a food. Since it's not a food, it's not mekabel tumah. Nevertheless, even though l'chayre it should be no different from a bamboo cane, which is okay, this is possible, and you cannot use it for schach. It's like you've got an airspace there. We will learn later on Daf Yud Zayin that airspace is more possible in a sukkah than possible schach. If a person has in a sukkah 3x3 space where there's no schach at all, just plain air, you can see the sky, that is already possible. But schach possible, you need to have 4x4. We'll come to it in Mitzvah Shem Daf Yud Zayin why we're more machmir by schach, by air, than by schach basal. But this lettuce leaves, and we'll talk about lettuce leaves which are not properly grown, which cannot be eaten, because otherwise be anyway possible schach as a camel tumah. This is something which is considered like an airspace. And the question is, why is it considered an airspace? So the answer is like this, that lettuce shrivels up. Let's see the more inside. Let's see. When they dry out, they crumble and fall. It's as if they're not there altogether. Meaning like this, that we treat it the chumrah both as a roof and not as a roof. These leaves are very, very easily shriveled. And the Vishash and the Rosh and others point out, not just these leaves, but other things as well. Any leaf, not just more. Anything which can easily become shriveled and become into nothing, we have to be machmir both ways. When the question is, can it spread tumah? You say, yes, it can spread tumah. Why? Because at the moment it's a leaf. Since it's a leaf, it's a tent. Since it's a tent, it can spread tumah. On the other hand, we're machmir as if it's not there. So therefore, it doesn't block tumah. The tumah goes up all the way to the heavens. And not only that, but if you use it as schach, we look at it as airspace. So it's got both chumras. Let's just summarize what we've just learned. There are certain leaves which shrivel easily and crumble easily and become non-existent. Those leaves have three chumras. We use them as a tent to spread tumah, because at the moment they are a tent. We don't use them as a tent to stop tumah, because they could easily stop being a tent. So even while they're fresh, we're choshesh that person might rely on them as a tent, and therefore come to rely on them even after they shrivel up. So therefore, even from the beginning, we stop it from tumah. And thirdly, we cannot use them as schach, and therefore the halacha is it's important to be aware that if a person, for example, wants to use schach, big leaves which easily shrivel, they are no good as schach. I remember somebody wanted to make a temporary schach. The mesh was perchim sim kind of perchim outer kind of schach. So what he did was he took a branch of an oak leaf. Now oak trees have very, very big green leaves. The problem is they dry up quite quick. And he went to Rabbi, and the Rabbi said to him, "This no good, these leaves, because they have to remain that they would last at least a week after being cut without shriveling up. And if they cannot, therefore they're no good." Okay. Now we're going to more halachas of tumah and more complicated. The halacha is for something to become tummy, it has to be a fruit. So, for example, if you've got a bunch of grapes, the grapes become tummy. The branches of the grapes, the vine, does not become tummy. It's not a fruit. What about the stalks? Do the stalks become tummy? Here we have a halacha that anything which is needed for the fruit and is the handle of the fruit becomes tummy like the fruit. So if a tummy person touches a bunch of grapes and he doesn't touch any of the grapes, he just touches the stalk, in most cases, the tumah will spread. This is called yodos hatumah, the handle of tumah. So Gemara says like this: if a person is harvesting his grapes for the sake of using them for wine, then the stalks do not spread tumah. Why? When a person wants to eat grapes, he's very happy with the stalks. Why is he happy with the stalks? Because without stalks, it's very clumsy to eat grapes. The grapes go everywhere. So the stalks are a handle to the grapes. When a person is producing wine, he would prefer there'd be no stalks. Every bit of stalk that falls into a bucket of wine actually ruins the wine. It draws the wine in, it can't be eaten, it ruins the wine. So the stalks for eating grapes are useful, and therefore they are spread tumah. The stalks for wine are not tumah. Again, the stalks for eating grapes, they spread tumah because the person wants it to eat the grapes. The stalks for wine, a person doesn't want them. Since a person doesn't want them, they're not a handle. Since they're not a handle, so therefore they do not spread tumah. Omar Avuna, a similar halacha. Again, so If a person's got this long stalk of grain, so the grain itself cannot be used for schach because grain is davar mekabel tumah. It's food; it can't be used for schach. The stalks can be used for schach. Now the question is, does he want the grain? What's the answer? Of course, he doesn't want the grain, because the grain, the more grain there is, the more likely that the schach is going to be possible. So therefore, all he really wants is the stalk. Get it clear. If you've got a big stalk of grain, what do you want? Do you want the stalk, not the grain? So the halacha is that in such a case, tumah doesn't spread from the stalk to the grain. Why? Because it's not a handle. Just like we said by a bunch of grapes for wine, the stalk doesn't spread the tumah to the grapes because you really prefer not to have the stalk. Also, stalks for grain, you really would prefer not to have the grain for the schach. If you've got a branch of oranges, the halacha is that the oranges are possible in schach because they're mekabel tumah. The branch is kosher for schach. So if you put a branch full of oranges, we go after the majority. So what happens is, the less oranges, the more likely that the schach is going to be kosher. Similarly, by grain, the less grain in the stalk, the more likely that the stalk is going to be kosher for schach. It says the more like this. Let's see inside. Again, by wine, everybody agrees you don't want the stalk, because every bit of stalk in the bucket of wine is just ruining the wine. It draws away the wine. Everything agrees it's no good. Why? Even within the schach, there's a purpose to the grain. Stalks fly off very easily because they're very light. Grain is much heavier. So when you have stalks to the grain, you need the grain, because the grain, what it does is it anchors the straw to the roof of the sukkah. So even though you don't really want the grain, because at the end of the day, the grain makes chach posel and the stalk is chach kosher. But there's an advantage to the grain, is it keeps the schach from blowing away. It's not like by the wine where you don't want the stalk at all. All the stalk does is ruins the wine. Here, the grain actually enhances the fact that the stalk should not fly away. So therefore, there is a bit of an advantage. So therefore, the tumah can spread. Says the Gemara, the Tanya, a branch of figs or ben tehenim, and it's got figs on it. Pachinin bunches of ben anovim, and it's got in it grapes. Koshin straw ben shibolim, it's got in it grain. Mechabdois, that's branches of olive trees. Or ben timon, it's got dates. The reason it's called mechabdois, mechabed is the Gemara uses many times for sweeping. Mechabed actually means to honor. When you sweep the floor, you're honoring the house. In the older days, as we mentioned, they used to use date palm branches, because they they look like a bit like a lulav. An open lulav looks a little bit like a broom. So mechabdois is date branches, or ben tamon, and it's got in it dates. Kula. In all of these cases, if there's more branch than food, ksheira. If there's more food than branch, psula. Others say, that means like this. There's three parts. Let's take a bunch of grapes. You've got the vine, which is not mekabel tumah. You've got the grapes, which is mekabel tumah. And you've got the stalks, which connect the grapes to the vine. Those stalks could be mekabel tumah, like we mentioned earlier, because they are a handle to the grapes. This Shitta Achem, which is Rameh, he holds that you have to have so much schach, so to speak, so much vine branches, that they outweigh not just the grapes, but the grapes plus the stalks. The Tanna Kama says the main thing is that the branches outweigh the grapes. And he says, no, they have to outweigh the grapes plus the stalks of the grapes. Obviously, what does Rabbi hold? He hopes that the stalks are tummy. And since they're tummy, they spread tumah. So Gemara says like this. My love, is this not the machlokas? The mass of ayesh yodos, that the tumah spreads through the hands. The mass of einam yodos, that they don't spread through the tumah. Says the Gemara, of course, it's machlokas tanoim. According to Manash Gadol, we've got a way to explain that it's not a machlokes. Omlach Manash, the Kol HaMesavi HaKritzah L'Schach Ein Lo Yodis. That of course it's not Mekabel Tumah. But over here, originally you cut the grain for eating. It was like this. Normally when you cut grain, you want the stalk. Why do you want the stalk? Because what happens is the only way you can get to the grain is if you have the stalk. If you don't have the stalk, what will happen is that you won't be able to get hold of the grain. So in normal circumstances, the stalk is a conduit for the grain, and therefore it spreads tumah from the stalk to the grain and vice versa. But when you're cutting for schach, you don't want the grain. Why don't you want the grain? Because you don't want your schach to be possible. So then it's like a split between the stalk and the grain. Says the Gemara that over here we're talking about a unique circumstances when you cut the stalk originally for eating purposes. And at that stage, the stalk was a conduit for tumah. And at a later stage, what happened was you changed your mind to use it for schach. And therefore, the tumah which originally fell on it, because of the fact that when you originally cut it, you intended it to be for the sake of eating, that tumah remains even after you cut it, and even after you change your mind for schach. And that is why the tumah still remains. That means we're talking about this unique circumstances where you cut it originally for eating purposes, then you change your mind, you're going to use it for schach. So therefore, the tumah spreads even later. If originally you cut it for eating, and the stalk was a conduit for tumah, what's the svar of the chachamim? That originally when you cut it for eating, the stalk was a conduit for tumah, and therefore it is considered a yada tumah. But later when you wanted it for schach, it's not. That means what's happening over here is that it's changing according to your thought. Let's explain a bit again. It's very, very important. It's like this. You cut a grain. What happens when you cut grain? You have a majority, a long stalk, and at the bottom, top end of it is a bit of grain. When you cut it for eating, you want the stalk in order to get hold of the grain. If the stalk would disappear, the grain would go everywhere. So since you want the stalk, everybody agrees that the tumah spreads from the stalk to the grain because it's like a handle of a pot. Just like if you touch a pot, the pot becomes tumah. If you touch the handle of the pot also becomes tumah because the handle is an important part of the pot because it helps you get hold of the pot. So too, the stalk of the grain helps you get the grain. So at that stage, when you cut it for eating, the stalk spread tumah. But then later you change your mind and you decide you're not going to eat this grain. What are you going to do with it? You're going to use it for schach. At that stage, you don't want the grain because the grain is only going to make a schach possible because grain is davar mekabel tumah. So at that stage, there's a split. So now you might have thought that the tumah should change according to your thought. Here the Gemara establishes a halacha regarding tumah, that tumah does not change with a thought. Now, where do we have this most? The halacha is that a piece of leather skin is only mekabel tumah once you've decided to use it as it is. So, for example, if you decide to make shoes out of a leather skin, it's not mekabel tumah, it doesn't catch tumah until it's a proper pair of shoes. If you decide to make it a blanket, you take the leather skin to make it as a blanket, so it catches tumah at a much, much earlier stage. So depending on what your intention to do with the skin is at which stage it's mekabel tumah. If your intention is to make it a blanket, so it catches tumah very early, as soon as it's a flat piece of leather, it's mekabel tumah, because it's going to be used as a blanket. And now at this stage, it is good as a blanket. So if it's mekabel tumah straight away. If your intention for the leather is to use it as a pair of shoes, so that it's not mekabel tumah till when? Until it's a pair of shoes. Now what happens like this? You take a piece of leather and you intend to use it as a blanket. So what happens? It's able to catch tumah because it's a good blanket. And at this stage, it's a keli. At this stage, it is something which can be used as a keli. And then what happens is you change your mind. You want to use it now as a pair of shoes. The halacha is it's too late. Had you originally decided to use it as a pair of shoes, you would never have caught tumah. and he wouldn't have been able to catch tumah because it's never royal, it was never fitting to be used as a keli. But now that you decide that it should be a blanket, so therefore it is royal to be makabel tumah. The fact that you change your mind doesn't work, and therefore the Gemara asks the kasha over here: when you cut the grain to eat it, and at that stage was a conduit for tumah, it should remain as a conduit for tumah constant. That's the Gemara's insight. Once you change your mind, so the machshava, the thought goes away. Does a thought ever go away? We've learned in the Mishnah, top of your Daled. They can become tomei just by thinking. How? If you look at a piece of skin and you decided, I want it to be as a blanket as it is, with just that thought, it's now possible for it to become tomei. The only way they come away from tomei is if you do an act. Let's say, for example, regarding this piece of skin which you decided to make it as a blanket, and then you change your mind, you want to make it as a pair of shoes. What did we say? It's still tomei, because at the end of the day, it is your thought can't cancel a thought. But let's say you start cutting up into pieces in order to make out of it shoes. Now that you've cut it, it's not fitting to be a blanket. And it's not yet ready to be a pair of shoes because you've just cut it, you haven't produced a pair of shoes. So since you did an act to take it away from a blanket, and it's not yet ready to be a pair of shoes, therefore it is become tumah. So then you manage to take away the tumah. And the Mishnah explains, Ma'isa, an act, Ma'isa can undo an act and a machshava. Machshava can't do anything. So at this stage, the Gemara leaves it as a kasha. And we're going to stop it at this stage. Let's just explain. We had a Mishnah that talked about grain that was cut, whether the grain spreads tumah, whether the stalk spread tumah or not. We suggested that we're talking about somebody that originally cut it with the intention to eat it and later changed his mind to use the schach. The Gemara says that cannot be true. Because when a person changes his mind, thought cannot undo thought. Since thought can't undo thought unless you actually do something to it, so therefore the tumah will still be there. So therefore this schach, which you originally planned to eat it, and when you plan to eat it, you needed the stalk, so if it is a tumah, remains there, and therefore the tumah doesn't go away, even with machshava. And if that's the case, it should still be tumah. We're going to leave it as a kasha. Mitzvah Shem, tomorrow we'll go to the answer. It is a bit difficult. The first daf we're doing over this Zoom is an extremely difficult daf, and in fact the next daf is also not so easy. But afterwards it does get much easier, gets much more into the Succca. Anybody's got any questions, feel free to text or ask or leave messages at any time. I don't always have reception, but when I do get the message,